Hi guys, the air over the Nile River was still cool in the final moments before dawn. Darkness rested softly across the flat land of ancient Egypt, covering the mud brick homes, the narrow paths between farms, and the quiet sleeping animals beside wooden fences. The river moved slowly through the night like black glass, calm and endless beneath the pale stars. Most people were still asleep. Inside small homes made from clay and straw, workers rested on woven reed mats laid across hard floors. Thin linen cloths covered tired bodies. The smell of dust, ash, and baked earth lingered in the warm darkness. Somewhere outside, a dog shifted softly in the sand. Farther away, water birds called quietly from the riverbank. A farmer opened his eyes before the sun appeared. For a few moments, he simply listened. The world was silent except for the soft breathing of his family nearby and the distant sound of moving water. His muscles already ached from the previous day. His back felt stiff. His hands were rough and dry from years of lifting baskets, cutting grain, and digging irrigation channels beneath the burning sun. Slowly, he sat up. The floor beneath him was cool. He rubbed sleep from his eyes and waited for his thoughts to fully wake. The room around him was small and dark. The walls held the warmth of yesterday's heat. Clay jars rested quietly near the doorway. A small oil lamp had burned low during the night, leaving behind the faint smell of smoke. Beside him, his wife still slept lightly beside their youngest child. Soon she would rise too. Outside, the first weak line of morning slowly appeared beyond the eastern horizon. It was not bright yet. The desert sky moved carefully from black into deep blue. Palm trees stood silently beside the river. Small fishing boats rocked gently near the shore. The farmer stepped outside barefoot into the cool dust. Many homes around him looked nearly the same. Flat roofs. Mud walls. Reed doors hanging slightly open. In some houses, faint light already flickered from cooking fires. Ancient Egypt rose early because the heat later in the day became heavy and difficult to bear. The village slowly awakened together. A woman carried water jars from a shared well. Two boys chased a sleepy goat through the narrow path between homes. Somewhere nearby, grain was already being ground into flour using heavy stone tools. The slow scraping sound blended softly into the quiet morning air. Above them all, the sky brightened little by little. The Nile River shaped nearly every part of life in ancient Egypt. Workers depended on it completely. The river gave water, fish, transportation, mud for bricks, and rich dark soil for farming. Without the Nile, much of the land would have been empty desert. But life beside the river was not easy. Most workers spent nearly every waking hour laboring beneath heat and dust. Their days followed rhythms that rarely changed. Sunrise brought work. Midday brought exhaustion. Night brought silence and brief rest before another morning arrived again. For ordinary people, life moved in steady circles. The farmer walked toward the edge of his field while carrying a wooden hoe across his shoulder. Sand pressed softly beneath his feet. The air smelled fresh for now, though soon the warmth would arrive. Other workers appeared along nearby paths, moving quietly in the same direction. No one spoke very much at this hour. Their minds still lingered somewhere between dreams and labor. As the sun slowly rose, the land changed color. Pale gold light spread across the fields. Long shadows stretched beside irrigation canals. Date palms shimmered faintly in the growing brightness. Birds drifted low over the river water. The farmer reached his land and paused. The soil was dark and damp near the canals. This rich earth arrived each year when the Nile flooded its banks. The flood season brought both relief and danger. It fed the crops, but it also demanded endless labor repairing canals, moving mud, and protecting homes from rising water. Nothing in Egypt remained untouched by work. Even children worked from a young age. Boys helped carry water, herd animals, gather reeds, and assist in the fields. Girls learned grinding grain, weaving cloth, baking bread, and caring for younger children. Few people enjoyed long periods of rest. The farmer bent down and pressed his fingers into the soil. Good moisture. That mattered. A poor harvest could bring hunger for an entire household. Workers lived close to survival. Food needed careful planning, and every season carried uncertainty. Grain was precious. Bread was precious. Oil, fish, onions, and beer were important parts of daily life because they kept workers strong enough to continue laboring. In the growing morning light, more figures appeared across the fields. Some carried baskets. Others led donkeys loaded with tools or jars. A group of laborers moved together toward a canal that needed clearing. Their sandals brushed softly through dry earth. Soon the sounds of work slowly filled the land. Wood striking soil. Water splashing. Quiet voices. Animals shifting. The steady scrape of tools. Ancient Egypt often appears in memory as a world of giant pyramids, shining temples, and powerful rulers. But most people never lived near luxury or glory. Most people spent their lives working until their bodies became tired and worn. Their history survived quietly beneath the shadows of kings. Many workers lived in homes with only a few rooms. Air moved through open windows covered by woven reeds. Roofs were flat and sometimes used for sleeping during very hot nights. Furniture was simple. Clay jars stored grain and water. Reed baskets held vegetables or tools. Small wooden stools sat near cooking spaces blackened by smoke. The smell of bread often filled these homes before sunrise. Bread took many forms in ancient Egypt. Some loaves were flat and simple. Others were thicker and shaped by hand before baking inside clay ovens. Grain had to be crushed first using heavy grinding stones. This work often fell to women and servants. Hour after hour, they knelt beside stone tools, pushing grain into flour. The labor damaged their hands, shoulders, and knees over time. Inside one small house near the river, a woman now crouched beside a grinding stone while morning light entered softly through the doorway. Her daughter sat nearby peeling onions into a clay bowl. Ash from the cooking fire drifted gently through the air. The woman moved steadily without rushing. She had done this nearly every day of her life. The rough stone made a low grinding sound that blended into the peaceful morning atmosphere outside. Occasionally she paused to wipe sweat from her forehead even though the day had barely begun. Heat arrived early in Egypt. As the sun climbed higher, workers across the land felt its weight settle onto their backs and shoulders. Farmers wrapped cloth around their heads for protection. Builders searched briefly for shade beside unfinished walls. Boatmen narrowed their eyes against the bright reflection dancing across river water. Still, work continued. Near one large town farther north, a group of brick makers already stood ankle-deep in mud. They mixed wet earth with straw using their bare feet, slowly pressing the mixture together before shaping bricks by hand. Rows of drying bricks stretched across the open ground beneath the growing sun. The men moved carefully but steadily. Their skin glistened with sweat and mud. Flies drifted through the warm air. Nearby, a young boy carried water jars back and forth to keep the mud mixture soft enough to shape. He was thin and quiet. Dust clung to his legs. Though still young, his work already mattered to the survival of his family. Many workers in ancient Egypt never traveled far from the places where they were born. Villages along the Nile became entire worlds. A person might know every tree, every dock, every canal, every bend in the nearby paths from childhood until old age. The seasons shaped memory. Flood season, planting season, harvest season. Each carried its own routines and hardships. When the Nile flooded, many farmers temporarily became laborers for large building projects organized by the state. Contrary to many old stories, pyramid workers were often skilled laborers and organized crews rather than chained slaves. They received food, shelter, and supplies for their labor, though the work itself remained exhausting beyond measure. Under the blazing sun, teams of workers dragged heavy stone blocks across prepared paths. Sweat soaked their linen clothing. Supervisors watched nearby while scribes recorded supplies, attendance, and completed work. The scribes lived different lives from the laborers. Their hands were softer. Their work demanded patience rather than physical strength. Scribes held an important place in Egyptian society because writing carried power. Records needed keeping. Taxes needed counting. Deliveries needed tracking. Messages needed copying onto papyrus scrolls using brushes and ink. Yet even scribes lived within routines. Inside a shaded administrative room near a temple courtyard, one scribe sat cross-legged with a wooden pallet resting on his lap. Thin black symbols flowed carefully across papyrus as sunlight entered through narrow windows high in the wall. Outside, laborers shouted softly while carrying baskets of stone chips. Inside, the scribe listened to the scratching sound of his own brush. His world smelled of ink, dust, warm stone, and old papyrus. He worked slowly because mistakes created problems. Records mattered deeply in a society built upon organized labor and controlled harvests. Grain storage alone required careful accounting. Egypt depended on successful harvest seasons, and officials monitored supplies closely. Even so, scribes also became tired. Their backs stiffened from long hours seated on hard floors. Their eyes strained in dim light. Their fingers cramped from constant writing. Though their labor looked easier than farming or hauling stone, it carried its own quiet exhaustion. By midday, the heat over Egypt became immense. The desert wind turned dry and heavy. Air shimmered above roads and rooftops. Workers paused more often beneath strips of shade whenever possible. Animals slowed their movement. Dust hung lazily in the brightness. For farmers in open fields, midday could feel endless. One older worker rested beside an irrigation ditch while eating a simple meal of bread and onions. He sat silently beneath a date palm while nearby water moved softly through narrow channels cut into the earth. His knees hurt badly now. Years of labor had worn down his body. Yet tomorrow he would return again before dawn, just as he always had. Many workers lived with constant pain that simply became part of ordinary existence. Sore backs, cracked skin, swollen feet, illness from dirty water, fever during flood season, infections from cuts or insect bites. Medicine existed in ancient Egypt, but access varied greatly. Wealthier people could seek trained healers and herbal remedies more easily. Ordinary workers often relied on home treatments, prayers, simple medicines, or endurance. At night, entire villages sometimes fell quiet with sickness. Still, life continued forward. Along the Nile River itself, fishermen drifted through reeds in small wooden boats while casting woven nets into dark green water. Fishing provided important food for many households. Tilapia and catfish were common catches. River birds circled overhead while insects buzzed low across the water surface. The fishermen moved gently to avoid disturbing the fish. Water lapped quietly against the sides of the boat. Far away, temple walls glowed white beneath the afternoon sun. The river connected nearly everything in Egypt. Boats carried grain, stone, workers, soldiers, animals, and goods between cities and villages. Without the Nile, movement across the land would have been painfully slow. Boatmen spent much of their lives upon the water. Their skin darkened beneath years of sunlight. Their hands hardened from rope and wood. They slept beside docks, beneath simple shelters, or sometimes directly on boats during long journeys. One merchant boat now drifted northward with a slow current. Clay jars rattled softly together inside the vessel while rolled linen cloth rested beneath woven coverings. The crew sat quietly during the hottest part of the day. No one wasted energy speaking. The heat pressed down upon everything. Back in the villages, women prepared the evening meal while children gathered reeds or carried water home. The smell of baking bread returned once more to the air. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires as sunlight slowly softened toward late afternoon. In one crowded workshop near a larger city, craftsmen continued laboring despite exhaustion. Woodworkers shaped furniture using bronze tools. Potters turned clay carefully beneath practiced hands. Linen weavers worked beside upright looms, pulling thread back and forth in repetitive motion hour after hour. The workshop smelled of sweat, clay dust, wood shavings, oil, and smoke. Open doorways allowed small currents of air to drift through, though little relief came from them. A young apprentice watched an older craftsman carve details into a wooden chair meant for a wealthy household. The apprentice hoped one day to master the skill himself. Skilled craftsmen sometimes earned greater respect and slightly better living conditions than field laborers. Still, their lives remained difficult. Most ordinary people in ancient Egypt worked constantly simply to maintain stability. Evenings brought some relief. As the sun lowered, long shadows stretched once more across the fields and roads. The worst heat slowly faded from the air. Workers returned home in small groups, moving quietly with tired bodies and dusty feet. The farmer from early morning now walked back toward his village carrying tools across aching shoulders. The sky above him glowed orange and soft gold. Birds crossed slowly overhead. He could smell cooking fires long before reaching home. Children ran through the narrow paths between houses while women spoke quietly near ovens and water jars. Donkeys brayed somewhere nearby. A baby cried briefly before settling again into silence. Inside his home, the farmer sat heavily upon a low stool while his wife handed him bread and beer made from fermented grain. The meal was simple but filling enough. Their children sat close beside them while oil lamp light flickered gently against mud brick walls. Outside, darkness slowly returned to Egypt. Night arrived differently in the ancient world. Without modern light, villages faded quickly into shadow after sunset. Lamps burned softly indoors, but beyond them stretched deep darkness beneath enormous skies filled with stars. The Nile reflected moonlight in long silver lines. Workers often slept early because dawn would return soon enough. Some evenings carried music from distant gatherings or temple ceremonies. Soft drums, reed flutes, singing voices drifting faintly through warm night air. But most nights remained quiet and ordinary. People rested. They spoke softly. They listened to insects beyond the walls. The farmer lay down once more upon his woven mat while nearby family members settled into sleep beside him. Through the doorway he could see a small piece of the night sky above the village rooftops. His body hurt deeply now. Yet there was comfort in the stillness after labor. Tomorrow would come again with the same river, the same fields, the same rising sun over ancient Egypt. During the deepest hours of night, ancient Egypt became softer and quieter than it ever was beneath the daytime sun. The roads emptied. Workshops rested in darkness. Boats drifted gently beside riverbanks with their ropes creaking softly against wooden docks. Only the Nile continued moving without pause, carrying cool black water through the sleeping land. Inside the villages, warm air lingered within mud brick walls long after sunset. Families slept close together on reed mats or simple wooden frames covered with woven cloth. Some rested on rooftops during the hottest months, hoping to catch the faintest movement of cooler night wind. Children turned slowly in their sleep while dogs wandered narrow alleys searching for scraps near dying cooking fires. From time to time, someone woke briefly. A mother checking on a feverish child. An old man rubbing pain from stiff joints. A fisherman preparing quietly for work before dawn. Most people in ancient Egypt learned to live with interrupted sleep. The heat, insects, noise from animals, and physical pain from labor often made deep rest difficult. Yet exhaustion eventually pulled nearly everyone back beneath sleep again. Far across the river plain, the stars remained bright and endless above the dark earth. Then slowly, almost invisibly, another morning approached. A faint gray light spread across the eastern horizon. The coolness before sunrise returned once more. Palm leaves stirred gently in the early breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster called out from a village courtyard. The fishermen usually rose among the earliest workers. One man now stepped carefully into his small reed boat while carrying rolled nets over one shoulder. His feet made soft sounds against damp wood. Mist hovered low across the Nile's surface, turning the river pale beneath the final moments of night. He pushed away from shore using a long wooden pole. The boat drifted slowly into the quiet water. This peaceful hour before sunrise often became the calmest moment of the entire day. The air felt softer. The sounds of labor had not yet begun. Even the birds seemed quieter while the world waited for light. The fisherman dipped his hand briefly into the cool river water. For generations beyond memory, workers had begun their days the same way along the Nile. Fathers taught sons how to cast nets, how to read currents, how to move silently through reeds where fish gathered in the early morning shadows. Fishing required patience more than speed. The fisherman scanned the water carefully while his small boat drifted beside thick green reeds alive with insects and nesting birds. Tiny ripples spread outward across the smooth river surface. Somewhere beneath the water, fish moved unseen through shadows. Then with one steady motion, he cast the net outward. The woven fibers spread wide through the air before falling softly into the river. Nearby, another fisherman checked woven traps left overnight close to shore. His hands smelled constantly of river water, fish scales, wet reeds, and mud. The scent followed him home every evening no matter how often he washed. Along the riverbanks, villages slowly awakened once more. Cooking fires returned. Doors opened. Footsteps pressed into dusty ground. Women carried clay jars balanced carefully upon their shoulders or heads while walking toward shared wells. Some spoke quietly together in the pale morning light. Others moved silently, still half asleep beneath the cool dawn sky. Water shaped nearly every hour of daily life. Without constant movement of water from the Nile into canals and fields, crops would fail beneath the desert heat. Irrigation work consumed endless labor. Workers dug channels, repaired walls, cleared mud, and guided water across farmland with careful attention. One broken canal could threaten entire harvests. Near a farming village south of Memphis, several men now stood knee-deep in muddy water clearing reeds and heavy silt from a narrow irrigation ditch. Their bodies bent forward beneath the effort. Wet mud clung thickly to their legs. Mosquitoes hovered around them in the warming air. The youngest worker among them was barely more than a boy. His arms already trembled with fatigue. But no one stopped working. Nearby, farmers inspected young crops growing in neat rows across dark fertile soil. Emmer wheat and barley covered much of the land during growing seasons. Vegetables such as onions, garlic, beans, and lettuce also appeared in smaller gardens near homes. The success of these crops determined survival. Workers understood the moods of the Nile with deep attention because their lives depended completely upon its behavior. Too little flooding brought weak harvests. Too much water destroyed fields and homes. The river gave life gently, but never freely. As sunrise spread fully across the land, the coolness faded quickly. Golden light touched temple walls, palm groves, boats, and distant desert cliffs. Workers narrowed their eyes against the growing brightness. Another long day had begun. In larger towns and cities, the streets slowly filled with movement. Merchants arranged goods beneath woven shade coverings. Bakers carried fresh loaves from clay ovens. Donkeys loaded with baskets moved through crowded roads while drivers called softly to clear paths ahead. The smells of the city mixed together in the warm air. Bread, smoke, sweat, animals, river mud, spices, fish drying beneath the sun. Ancient Egyptian cities were busy places, though not loud in the way modern cities are. Much movement happened slowly. People walked almost everywhere. Goods traveled by hand, animal, or boat. Dust rose constantly from roads beneath countless sandals and bare feet. Near the market district of one riverside town, a linen merchant carefully unfolded pale cloth for inspection by customers. Linen mattered greatly in Egypt because the climate demanded light clothing. Workers often wore simple linen wraps or short kilts suited to the heat. Wealthier people could afford finer woven fabric that felt softer against the skin. The merchant sat beneath shade while fanning himself lazily with woven reeds. Even early in the day, sweat gathered along his neck. Across the market, potters displayed rows of jars, bowls, and storage vessels baked hard beneath fire. Pottery existed everywhere in ordinary Egyptian life. Water jars lined household walls. Grain rested inside clay containers. Beer fermented in large ceramic vessels cooled by shaded rooms. Many workers spent entire lives shaping clay. One potter now sat beside a spinning wheel while pressing wet earth carefully between practiced fingers. His hands moved almost without thought. He had learned this rhythm from his father long ago. Spin. Shape. Smooth. Lift. Again and again through the years. The workshop around him remained warm even before midday because nearby kilns radiated lingering heat from earlier firings. Apprentices carried stacks of dried vessels carefully toward storage shelves while ash floated gently through narrow shafts of sunlight. Beyond the workshops and markets stood the homes of wealthier Egyptians. These houses were larger, cooler, and more comfortable than village homes. Some contained painted walls, private gardens, servants, and shaded courtyards with pools of water meant to cool the air. Servants handled much of the labor inside such households. Young women ground grain, washed linen, carried water, prepared food, and cleaned floors daily from sunrise until night. Male servants managed animals, guarded entrances, or assisted with transport and heavy lifting. Though they lived differently from field workers, servants also knew exhaustion well. Inside one wealthy home near Thebes, a servant girl now knelt beside a low basin washing linen garments in cool water scented faintly with oils. Her fingers moved carefully across the fabric while distant voices echoed softly through shaded hallways. She had risen long before sunrise. By afternoon, her back would ache sharply from bending over basins and carrying heavy jars through the household. The wealthy depended completely upon invisible labor surrounding them. Farther away from the cities, workers at stone quarries already faced brutal conditions beneath the strengthening sun. Egypt's monuments demanded enormous amounts of limestone, sandstone, and granite. Quarry workers cut heavy blocks directly from cliffs using copper tools, wooden wedges, pounding stones, and relentless physical effort. The sound of hammering echoed across the quarry walls. Dust coated everything. Men strained together pulling stone across wooden sledges while overseers shouted instructions nearby. Water was poured over sand to reduce friction beneath heavy loads. Every movement required teamwork and endurance. Some workers sang quietly to maintain rhythm during difficult pulls. Others saved their breath entirely. The heat became dangerous by midday. Sunlight reflected fiercely from pale stone surfaces, surrounding the workers with brightness and burning air. Skin blistered. Eyes watered from dust and glare. Water carriers moved constantly between crews with jars balanced across wooden poles. Even brief shade became precious. Workers crowded beneath temporary coverings during short breaks while drinking beer mixed with water and eating bread, dried fish, or onions. Meals remained simple because simplicity allowed survival. Luxury belonged elsewhere. In farming villages, midday brought a slower pace whenever possible. Animals rested beneath trees. Children sought shade beside walls. Workers paused briefly before returning to the fields once the worst heat began to ease. Inside homes, women continued preparing food for evening meals. Cooking demanded long hours of careful labor. Grain needed grinding. Dough needed shaping. Vegetables required cleaning and cutting. Fish had to be salted or dried for storage. Fires required tending despite smoke and heat. One elderly woman now sat beside a clay oven pressing flat rounds of dough between weathered hands. Fine flour dust covered her fingers and arms. Behind her, a granddaughter sorted lentils into bowls while listening quietly to the soft crackling of firewood. The room smelled warm and comforting. Bread baking. Smoke drifting upward. Earth walls holding trapped heat. Outside, the village shimmered beneath afternoon sunlight. Life expectancy in ancient Egypt was not long for many ordinary workers. Years of physical labor weakened bodies early. Teeth wore down from gritty bread made with stone-ground flour. Injuries often healed poorly. Disease spread easily through crowded living conditions and insects near standing water. Yet people continued building families, raising children, sharing meals, and finding moments of peace within difficult lives. Love existed beside labor. So did friendship. So did quiet laughter during evening rest. Near a riverside dock, two boat workers now repaired worn fishing nets together beneath partial shade. Their hands moved steadily through the tangled fibers while nearby water slapped softly against moored boats. They spoke little. The older man occasionally pointed toward damaged sections needing stronger knots. The younger worker nodded and continued weaving patiently. Above them, birds drifted lazily through the hot air. The Nile remained the center of everything. Travelers moved along its waters carrying stories, goods, and news between distant towns. Priests journeyed to temples upriver. Merchants transported grain and papyrus. Government officials inspected storehouses and collected taxes. Farmers watched the river levels constantly throughout the seasons. The river connected rich and poor alike. Late in the afternoon, the quality of light slowly changed again across Egypt. The harsh brightness softened into warmer gold tones. Long shadows stretched across courtyards and fields. A slight breeze returned from the river. Workers felt relief approaching. Children emerged once more into open spaces between homes. Goats wandered dusty paths. Merchants packed away unsold goods beneath linen coverings. Potters stacked cooling vessels beside workshop walls. At the edge of one village, a farmer guided tired oxen slowly back toward their enclosure after a long day plowing fields. Dust clung thickly to the animals' legs. The farmer's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Still, there was comfort in returning home. His wife would already be preparing the evening meal. Oil lamps would soon glow softly against the darkness. The village itself seemed calmer at this hour. Voices lowered naturally as temperatures cooled. Workers washed dust from their hands and feet using precious water carried carefully from wells or canals. Some men gathered briefly outside homes sharing beer after labor while discussing river levels, harvest concerns, or repairs needed in the fields. Others simply sat silently enjoying the cooler air against tired skin. An old musician somewhere nearby played a reed flute softly as twilight settled over the land. The sound drifted slowly through the evening. Inside homes, families ate together from shared bowls and platters. Bread remained the center of nearly every meal. Alongside it came onions, beans, dates, fish, figs, or occasionally meat during special occasions or festivals. Meals were rarely large. But after a day of labor, even simple food brought comfort. One small child fell asleep beside the family meal before finishing his bread. His mother smiled faintly while lifting him gently onto a woven mat near the wall. The oil lamp beside them flickered quietly in the growing darkness. Outside, stars slowly appeared once again above ancient Egypt. Temple walls cooled beneath the night air. The river reflected moonlight between dark reeds. Distant drums echoed faintly from a religious ceremony farther along the Nile. But most workers prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would arrive early. Always early. The rhythms of labor never truly stopped beside the ancient river. Before the first light touched the Nile, the air carried a rare coolness across the sleeping fields of Egypt. Night still covered the villages, though the darkness had already begun to thin near the eastern horizon. Palm trees stood motionless beside quiet canals. Boats rocked gently against their moorings. Somewhere in the distance, water birds stirred among the reeds. Inside a small mud brick house near the riverbank, a baker awoke long before most others. His body moved carefully in the darkness, stiff from years spent lifting sacks of grain and feeding hot ovens. He sat quietly for a moment while listening to the peaceful breathing of his family nearby. The room smelled faintly of ash and old bread. Dust rested along the floor and walls. A tiny oil lamp flickered weakly beside stacked clay jars. Outside, the world remained soft and silent. The baker stepped into the narrow street carrying a small basket of fuel for the ovens. Sand pressed cool beneath his sandals. Overhead, stars still glimmered faintly above the sleeping village. Only a few other workers moved through the darkness at this hour. Bread makers. Fishermen. Water carriers. The earliest laborers. Bread mattered deeply in ancient Egypt. Nearly every household depended on it every day. Workers carried loaves into the fields at sunrise. Boat crews packed bread beside jars of beer before journeys upriver. Builders ate bread beneath temporary shade while hauling stone under the sun. Without bread, labor became impossible. The baker reached the communal ovens near the center of the village. The clay structures stood silent beneath the final moments of night. He crouched beside one oven and carefully arranged dried reeds, wood scraps, and dung fuel inside the fire chamber. Soon the first thin stream of smoke rose into the cool air. Other bakers arrived quietly carrying baskets of dough prepared during the night. Their movements were calm and practiced. No one rushed. They had repeated this work for many years. As the fires strengthened, orange light flickered across nearby walls. The smell of warming clay slowly spread through the village. Farther away along the Nile, another group of workers already traveled south by boat beneath the fading stars. They were transport laborers carrying jars of grain toward a larger city farther upriver. The river current moved steadily beneath them while a square linen sail hung quietly in the weak night breeze. One man sat near the front of the vessel rubbing sleep from tired eyes. His life belonged mostly to movement now. River travel. Loading cargo. Sleeping beside docks. Unloading grain. Then beginning again. Many laborers in ancient Egypt rarely owned much beyond clothing, tools, and a few household items. Wealth gathered mostly among priests, officials, merchants, and noble families. Ordinary workers survived through constant effort rather than stored riches. Yet even simple possessions held meaning. A carefully woven mat. A smooth clay drinking cup. A wooden comb. A necklace made from colored beads. These small things brought beauty into difficult lives. As dawn slowly approached, the eastern sky turned pale blue above the desert cliffs. Birds began calling from the river reeds. Smoke from cooking fires drifted gently upward into the still morning air. The village awakened once more. Children carried baskets. Women fetched water. Farmers lifted tools onto weary shoulders. Ancient Egypt rose together each morning like a great breathing machine built from thousands of ordinary routines. Near one farming settlement west of the Nile, an elderly farmer walked slowly through damp fields inspecting young barley shoots growing from dark soil. His knees troubled him badly now. Each step brought pain through his legs and lower back. But he continued moving carefully between the rows because the crops required constant attention. The Nile flood had been good this season. That gave him some peace. Nearby, younger workers repaired a damaged irrigation wall using packed mud and woven reeds. Water seeped slowly through cracks while they worked. If the wall failed entirely, precious water would escape before reaching the farther fields. The workers pressed wet mud into place with bare hands. Mud coated their fingers, arms, and knees. The morning remained pleasant for now, though everyone knew the heavy heat would arrive before long. In ancient Egypt, labor changed with the seasons but never disappeared. During flood season, farmers often worked on state building projects because much farmland rested underwater. During planting season, every able body helped prepare the soil. Harvest season brought long exhausting days cutting grain beneath blazing skies. The rhythm of work controlled nearly all life. Even festivals and religious ceremonies fit carefully around agricultural demands. Religion itself existed quietly beside daily labor. Workers prayed for protection, good harvests, healthy children, and relief from sickness. Small household shrines sometimes stood in corners of homes beside simple offerings of bread, flowers, or incense. The gods felt close to ordinary life. Very close. A fisherman might whisper a prayer before casting nets. A mother might pray over a sick child. A laborer might speak softly to the gods before lifting stone beneath dangerous conditions. Faith moved gently through daily routines rather than standing apart from them. As sunlight spread fully across the land, the sounds of Egypt grew stronger. Donkeys brayed. Wood creaked. Voices echoed through narrow streets. Stone grinders scraped steadily inside homes. The bakers' ovens now glowed with fierce heat as rows of bread baked inside clay chambers blackened by years of smoke. Sweat already covered the baker's forehead despite the early hour. He used a wooden paddle to move loaves deeper into the oven while ash floated softly around him. The smell of fresh bread drifted through nearby streets. Children often appeared first whenever bread emerged from the ovens. Small hands reached eagerly toward warm loaves carried home inside woven baskets. Hunger arrived early for growing bodies. Food preparation consumed enormous amounts of labor each day. Unlike modern kitchens, ancient households lacked quick tools or stored conveniences. Everything required time. Water had to be carried manually. Grain needed grinding. Fires needed fuel. Ingredients spoiled quickly in the heat. Even preserving food became work. Fish were salted beneath the sun. Dates were dried carefully. Beer fermented slowly in clay jars. Workers depended heavily on beer because it provided nourishment and safer liquid than stagnant water sources. Egyptian beer was thick and cloudy compared to modern forms. It often contained bits of grain and carried a sour smell familiar to nearly everyone. Laborers drank it daily. Children drank weaker forms. At one riverside worksite, builders now paused briefly during the morning to share bread and beer beneath a simple shade covering made from linen cloth stretched between wooden poles. One younger laborer leaned back against a stone block while flexing sore fingers. Tiny cuts covered his hands from rough rope and stone edges. Nearby, an older worker stared silently toward the river while chewing slowly. His face carried deep lines from years beneath the sun. Much of his life had passed on construction sites just like this one. Temple walls. Storage buildings. Roads. Canals. Endless labor beneath endless sunlight. The great monuments of Egypt were built not only through engineering skill, but through ordinary human exhaustion repeated day after day. Workers organized themselves into teams for large projects. Some groups developed strong bonds through shared labor. They ate together, rested together, suffered together beneath the heat. Sometimes they joked quietly during breaks. Sometimes they sang while pulling ropes. Sometimes they simply worked in silence. Farther north, inside a busy weaving workshop, rows of women now worked carefully beside upright looms. Linen thread stretched tightly between wooden frames while skilled hands moved back and forth creating cloth for clothing, sails, blankets, and household use. The room felt hot and crowded. Dust floated through narrow shafts of light. The steady clicking sound of looms filled the workshop like gentle rain. One young weaver paused briefly to rub tired eyes before returning to her work. She had begun learning weaving as a child beside her mother. Now her hands moved automatically through patterns learned over many years. Pull. Thread. Tighten. Repeat. The repetition became almost peaceful despite the fatigue. In many Egyptian households, women carried enormous responsibility. Beyond preparing food and raising children, they often helped manage supplies, care for animals, make clothing, grind grain, and support agricultural labor during busy seasons. Their work rarely ended. Yet within homes, women also created much of the comfort and stability that allowed families to survive difficult conditions. A mother brushing dust from a sleeping child. Fresh bread cooling beside the fire. Water jars filled before sunrise. Quiet songs sung during evening hours. These small acts shaped daily life as deeply as the labor in fields and workshops. As midday approached once more, the sunlight sharpened across Egypt. White walls reflected fierce brightness into the streets. Heat radiated upward from packed earth roads. Workers wrapped cloth across their heads and necks for protection. The river itself glittered painfully beneath the sun. Boat crews slowed their movements to preserve energy. Farmers bent low while working to avoid direct glare. Animals gathered beneath whatever shade they could find. One donkey driver guided heavily loaded animals along a dusty road toward a grain storehouse near the city. Sweat darkened his linen clothing. Dust coated his legs completely. The donkeys moved slowly beneath the weight of grain sacks. Everything in ancient Egypt depended on transport. Grain needed moving. Stone needed hauling. Water needed carrying. Wood needed delivery from distant lands because Egypt itself lacked large forests. The movement of goods required countless ordinary workers whose names disappeared long ago into silence. Near the grain storehouse, scribes sat beneath shaded entrances recording deliveries onto papyrus scrolls. Their brushes moved carefully while workers unloaded heavy sacks nearby. One scribe paused to stretch cramped fingers. Though protected from the harshest labor, he still spent long hours working in uncomfortable heat. Sweat gathered beneath his collar while flies drifted lazily through the shaded room. Outside, laborers carried grain into storage chambers designed to protect supplies from moisture and pests. Grain was life itself. Poor storage could mean famine later. The workers formed long human lines passing sacks hand to hand. Step after step. Hour after hour. Their breathing grew heavier in the heat. By late afternoon, the entire land seemed to move more slowly. Exhaustion settled over fields and cities alike. Shadows lengthened gradually beside walls and palm trees. Children returned from errands carrying bundles of reeds or small baskets of vegetables. Elderly villagers sat quietly outside homes enjoying the first hints of cooler air. Potters checked kill fires one final time before evening. The baker's workday finally neared its end. Inside the now cooling bakery, he swept ash carefully across the floor while stacked loaves rested nearby waiting for morning distribution. His arms felt heavy. Smoke clung to his clothing and hair. Soon he would walk home through darkening streets beneath the evening sky. Along the Nile, fishermen prepared once again for nighttime work. Certain fish moved more actively during cooler hours after sunset. Nets needed repairing. Boats needed checking before departure. The river never truly slept. Neither did many workers whose labor followed tides, animals, or transport schedules instead of daylight alone. As the sun disappeared behind the western desert, Egypt softened once more into warm evening colors. Orange light touched temple columns and village rooftops. Smoke drifted upward from hundreds of cooking fires. The smell of evening meals spread across the land. Lentil stew. Roasted fish. Fresh bread. Onions cooked slowly over open flames. Families gathered together inside homes while darkness slowly returned. Oil lamps flickered against mud walls. Tired workers stretched aching limbs before settling onto mats for rest. Outside, the Nile reflected the first pale stars of night. The sounds of labor faded little by little. Voices softened. Footsteps disappeared. And once again, ancient Egypt prepared itself quietly for sleep beside the endless river. The night air along the Nile carried the smell of damp earth and cooling stone. After the long heat of the day, even a slight breeze felt gentle against tired skin. Villages rested quietly beneath the stars while the river continued its endless movement through the dark land of Egypt. Most homes had gone silent. Cooking fires faded into glowing red embers. Oil lamps flickered weakly inside small rooms where entire families slept close together. The heavy labor of the day pulled people quickly into deep exhaustion. Bodies worn by farming, hauling, grinding grain, rowing boats, and carrying water rarely stayed awake long after nightfall. Yet some workers still moved quietly through the darkness. Near a riverside dock, a night watchman walked slowly between tide boats while carrying a small lamp. The flame shook softly each time the wind touched it. He listened to the creaking ropes, the gentle slap of water against wood, and the distant calls of birds somewhere deep within the reeds. His work was lonely. Most nights passed without trouble. But theft could happen near busy docks where grain, cloth, fish, and pottery waited for transport at sunrise. The watchman paused from time to time beside sleeping cargo boats covered with linen cloths and bundles of rope. Above him, the sky stretched wide and clear. Ancient Egypt at night often felt larger and quieter than during the day. Without the bright sun, the land softened into shadow and silver moonlight. The desert beyond the river became calm and distant. Temple walls cooled slowly beneath the stars. Palm leaves rustled gently in the darkness. Inside one small house at the edge of a farming village, an old woman remained awake beside a sick child. The boy's breathing sounded weak and uneven. Fever had settled heavily over him since the afternoon. A clay bowl of cool water rested nearby while the woman dipped cloth into it and pressed it gently against the child's forehead. Outside, insects hummed softly in the night air. Illness was a constant part of ordinary life in ancient Egypt. Workers lived close together. Water sources could become contaminated. Cuts and infections often turned dangerous in the heat. Many families lost children long before adulthood. Yet people continued caring for one another with quiet patience. Herbal remedies were common. Honey, herbs, oils, and ground minerals were used in treatments passed down through generations. Some healers carried considerable knowledge about wounds and sickness. Others mixed medicine with prayers and spiritual rituals. For ordinary workers, survival often depended on endurance and family support. The old woman whispered softly to comfort the child even as exhaustion pulled at her own body. She had spent the entire day grinding grain, baking bread, and carrying water before sitting awake through the night. This too was labor. Quiet labor. Invisible labor. Beyond the village, fields rested beneath pale moonlight. Irrigation canals reflected silver lines across the dark earth. Frogs called softly from shallow water while reeds swayed beside the riverbanks. A farmer sleeping nearby stirred briefly on his woven mat. Even in sleep, his body remembered work. His hands twitched slightly as though still gripping tools. His shoulders remained tense from lifting heavy baskets. The rhythms of labor lived deep inside the muscles of workers long after the day ended. Eventually, the darkest hour before dawn arrived once more. The air cooled further. The stars began fading slowly above the eastern horizon. Somewhere in the distance, the first boatmen were already waking for river travel before sunrise. Another day approached quietly. Inside a crowded worker settlement near a temple construction site, laborers slowly rose from sleep one by one. Some rubbed sore knees before standing. Others stretched stiff backs while reaching for linen clothing hanging beside the walls. The settlement smelled of dust, sweat, smoke, and damp earth. Rows of simple mud brick homes stood close together beneath the fading night sky. These communities housed many skilled laborers who worked on royal tombs, temples, and state projects. Life here revolved completely around organized work schedules. One stone worker stepped outside carrying a small piece of bread left from the previous evening meal. He ate slowly while watching the horizon brighten beyond the desert cliffs. The silence before dawn felt peaceful. Briefly peaceful. Soon the sounds of tools and voices would return again. At the edge of the settlement, women were already lighting cooking fires. Tiny sparks drifted upward into the cool air. Clay ovens warmed slowly while grain was prepared for the morning meal. Children still slept nearby, curled beneath thin linen coverings. In many households, mornings followed nearly identical patterns every day. Water first. Fire second. Bread preparation. Gathering tools. Feeding animals. Then labor until sunset. Routine shaped existence. And within that routine, people found stability. Near the Nile itself, rows of fishermen now prepared their boats beneath soft early light. Nets hung drying from wooden poles. One older fisherman carefully checked knots while his son untangled rope nearby. Neither spoke very much. The son had learned through observation more than instruction. Watch the water. Watch the birds. Watch the movement beneath the surface. Fishing required attention to quiet details. The river could appear calm while hiding danger beneath it. Crocodiles lived along parts of the Nile. Hippos sometimes damaged boats or attacked without warning. Sudden currents overturned careless fishermen. Even ordinary work carried risks. Still, the fishermen pushed away from shore as dawn spread across the water. The Nile glowed pale gold beneath the rising sun. Birds crossed low over the reeds. The day began again. Back in the farming villages, the first workers entered the fields before the heat grew too strong. One group harvested flax used for linen production. The tall plants swayed softly in the morning breeze while workers bent low cutting bundles near the roots. Their movements were steady and repetitive. Cut. Gather. Tie. Carry. Again and again. The smell of crushed plants mixed with damp soil and river air. Nearby, women gathered leftover stalks into baskets for transport back to the village where fibers would later be processed into thread. Linen production involved many stages and enormous labor. Plants needed harvesting. Fibers soaked and separated. Threads spun carefully by hand. Cloth woven slowly on looms. Even a simple linen garment represented countless hours of invisible work. As the sun climbed higher, activity increased across the land. In crowded cities, merchants arranged fresh produce beside baskets of dates and figs. Potters carried newly fired vessels into market spaces. Donkeys moved through narrow streets beneath loads of grain or stone. The sounds blended together into the steady pulse of Egyptian life. Sandals scraping stone. Voices calling softly. Animals shifting. Tools striking wood. Water splashing from carried jars. Near a large temple complex, priests began their morning rituals while servants swept courtyards already warming beneath sunlight. Temple workers formed another hidden layer of labor within Egyptian society. Incense preparation. Cleaning sacred rooms. Maintaining gardens. Preparing offerings. Carrying water. Washing linen. Even sacred spaces depended on ordinary workers rising before dawn every day. One young temple servant carried heavy water jars through long shaded corridors lined with painted walls. Cool stone beneath his feet offered brief relief from the growing heat outside. The faint smell of incense drifted through the air. Though still young, his shoulders already carried visible strain from constant lifting. Ancient Egypt relied heavily on human strength. Almost everything required carrying, pulling, grinding, lifting, rowing, or digging by hand. Without machines or engines, the body itself became the center of labor. And bodies wore down slowly over time. By midday, sunlight poured harshly across rooftops and open fields once again. Workers wrapped linen cloth tighter around their heads. Shade became precious. Along a dusty road leading toward a quarry site, a group of laborers paused briefly beneath a cluster of palm trees. Their water jars were nearly empty already. Fine dust coated their faces and arms completely. One younger man removed his sandals and rubbed blistered feet against the cooler sand beneath the shade. No one complained much. Complaints changed little. Instead, workers learned to endure discomfort quietly because survival depended upon continuing forward each day. At the quarry itself, hammering echoed loudly against stone walls beneath the burning sky. Workers chipped carefully along marked lines while others prepared wooden sledges for transporting cut blocks. Stone dust floated constantly through the air. Sweat carved pale lines down mud-covered skin. Nearby supervisors recorded progress while scribes sat beneath shade writing notes onto papyrus scrolls. Even here, amid difficult labor, small moments of humanity appeared. One worker shared water with another whose jar had emptied. Someone laughed softly at a quiet joke during a brief pause. An older laborer adjusted the shoulder cloth of a younger apprentice to protect his neck from the sun. Tiny acts of care moved quietly through the harshness of daily life. Farther north, along a calmer section of the Nile, women washed linen clothing beside the riverbank while children played nearby in shallow water. The sound of splashing mixed gently with distant bird calls and rustling reeds. The women beat cloth carefully against smooth stones before rinsing it in the river current. Wet linen clung heavily to their arms. Sunlight reflected brightly from the moving water. This work too lasted for hours. Everything lasted for hours. Ancient life moved slowly because nearly every task demanded physical effort and time. As afternoon approached, heat shimmered above the land once more. Villages became quieter during the hottest hours. Some workers rested briefly inside shaded rooms or beneath woven coverings stretched between poles. A scribe in one administrative building paused from writing to massage cramped fingers and tired eyes. Around him, shelves of scrolls rested inside cool storage rooms thick with the smell of papyrus and ink. Outside, laborers still carried grain sacks across the courtyard. The contrast between different kinds of labor existed everywhere in Egypt. Some workers strained with muscles. Others strained with concentration and endless repetition. But fatigue touched nearly everyone. Late in the day, the light slowly softened again. Golden sunlight spread across temple walls and river water. Boats returned toward docks carrying fish catches, grain deliveries, and tired workers. Dust drifted lazily through village streets. Children ran to greet returning parents. Dogs barked. Cooking fires were lit once more. The familiar smells of evening slowly filled the air. Bread baking. Lentils cooking. Fish roasting above open flames. One exhausted farmer sat outside his home removing dirt from beneath cracked fingernails while his wife prepared the evening meal nearby. Their youngest daughter slept beside the doorway with her head resting against a woven basket. The farmer watched the sky darken above the palms. For a few quiet moments, there was no work to do. Only rest. Only breathing. Only the soft evening air moving gently through the village. As darkness returned across ancient Egypt, the Nile reflected the first stars once again, and thousands of ordinary workers slowly settled into sleep beside the ancient river. The Nile moved quietly through the darkness like a slow living thing, calm beneath the stars of ancient Egypt. Along its banks, entire villages rested in silence after another long day of labor. Warm wind drifted softly across mud brick walls and sleeping rooftops. Palm trees swayed gently against the pale moonlight. Most workers were deeply asleep now. Their breathing filled the small rooms of crowded homes where families rested side by side on woven mats. Some dreamed peacefully. Others turned often in discomfort from sore backs, aching knees, and tired muscles that never fully recovered from daily work. Beyond the villages, desert cliffs stood silent beneath the night sky. The world felt still. Only the river continued moving. Near a narrow canal south of Thebes, a young canal worker woke before dawn with pain already settled heavily in his shoulders. He opened his eyes slowly to darkness and listened to the faint sound of insects outside the house. For a moment, he remained still. His body wanted more sleep. But work began early, and water channels needed repair before the day grew too hot. He rose carefully from his mat without waking the others nearby. The floor beneath his feet still held a trace of coolness from the night air. In the corner of the room, clay jars rested against the wall beside bundles of reeds and simple wooden tools. Outside, the village remained quiet beneath fading stars. A few cooking fires had already begun glowing softly through open doorways. Somewhere nearby, grainstones scraped slowly together as an older woman prepared flour before sunrise. The young worker walked toward the canal carrying a wooden shovel across his shoulder. The smell of wet earth grew stronger as he approached the water. Irrigation canals formed the hidden veins of Egyptian life. Without them, river water could not reach distant farmland. Workers spent endless hours digging, clearing, repairing, and managing these channels to keep crops alive beneath the harsh desert climate. The labor was muddy, exhausting, and constant. When canals clogged with silt after flooding seasons, workers entered waist-deep water beneath the hot sun to clear heavy mud by hand. Mosquitoes hovered around stagnant pools. Wet reeds scratched against bare skin. Yet the work had to continue. Without water, fields dried quickly. As dawn slowly spread across the eastern horizon, more laborers arrived beside the canal. Their faces looked tired in the pale morning light. Some carried baskets. Others brought hose or rope. They greeted one another quietly. No one wasted much energy speaking this early. The workers climbed carefully into the shallow water and began removing thick mud from the canal floor. The mud felt cool at first against their legs. Birds moved through the nearby reeds while the first sunlight touched the tops of distant palm trees. For a brief time, the morning remained peaceful. But the heat would come. Always the heat. Farther north along the Nile, another village slowly awakened beside white-green fields of barley nearing harvest. Farmers stepped from their homes into the cool dawn carrying curved sickles made with wooden handles and sharp stone blades. Harvest season demanded long, exhausting days. Entire families often worked together in the fields from sunrise until darkness. Men cut the grain while women and children gathered bundles into stacks for transport. Dust filled the air around the workers as dry stalks rustled softly beneath the morning breeze. One farmer paused briefly before beginning work and looked toward the river. Mist hovered low above the water. The sight brought him quiet comfort. Many ordinary Egyptians lived deeply connected to the natural rhythm surrounding them. The movement of birds, the smell of wet soil, the shape of clouds above the desert, the sound of wind through reeds along the Nile, these small details became part of daily awareness. Workers noticed the world carefully because survival depended on attention. A change in water level mattered. A damaged canal mattered. Darkening skies mattered. Even the behavior of animals could signal danger or changing seasons. As the sun rose higher, the harvest began in earnest. The sound of cutting grain spread steadily across the fields. Slice. Gather. Tie. Carry. The repetitive motion slowly exhausted the body. Workers bent forward for hours beneath direct sunlight while dust clung to sweaty skin and linen clothing. Children moved among the adults carrying water jars from shaded resting areas. The jars grew lighter very quickly beneath the growing heat. One small boy stumbled slightly while carrying a heavy vessel nearly as large as his chest. An older worker steadied him gently before continuing with the harvest. No one wanted to waste water. Water was precious even beside the Nile. In larger towns, mornings brought crowded movement through narrow streets lined with workshops and market stalls. Merchants opened woven coverings above their goods while potters arranged fresh vessels along stone walls warming beneath the sun. The smells of city life thickened quickly in the heat. Baking bread, animal dung, fish drying near the river, smoke rising from ovens, sweat from crowded bodies moving through dusty streets. Near the center of one busy town, a copper worker already sat beside a small furnace feeding charcoal into glowing heat. Copper tools dulled quickly during hard labor and needed constant repair or reshaping. The workshop glowed orange in the dim morning light. Metal workers lived surrounded by heat even before midday arrived. Their arms darkened from soot and smoke. Sparks floated through the air while hammering echoed from stone walls. The copper worker lifted a softened tool carefully with tongs and hammered its edge against stone. Again. 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 Nearby apprentices pumped air into the furnace using bellows made from animal skin. The work demanded patience and strength together. Across the street, a scribe entered a cool administrative building carrying rolled papyrus beneath one arm. Compared to field laborers or quarry workers, his life appeared more comfortable. But his days still followed strict routines shaped by endless records and careful observation. He sat cross-legged upon the floor beside low wooden writing boards while morning sunlight filtered through narrow windows high in the walls. Soon grain tallies would arrive. Tax records, supply inventories, labor reports. The entire machinery of Egyptian society depended heavily on written organization. Outside the building, laborers unloaded grain from donkey carts while dust drifted through shafts of light. The scribe dipped his brush into dark ink and began another long day of careful writing. Along the Nile itself, river traffic increased beneath the brightening sky. Boats carrying stone, grain, vegetables, papyrus, linen, and pottery moved steadily between villages and cities. Boatmen understood the river deeply. They studied currents, wind patterns, hidden sandbars, dangerous stretches of water. Many spent more time on boats than inside homes. One transport vessel now moved slowly northward under a square linen sail while crew members rested briefly beside stacked cargo jars. The river breeze cooled their skin slightly as they drifted along green riverbanks alive with birds and reeds. One sailor hummed softly while repairing frayed rope. The sound blended peacefully with the water against the hull. River life carried its own rhythm separate from the fields and workshops ashore. Sailors slept beneath open skies, ate simple meals on board, and watched entire landscapes drift slowly past day after day. Yet their labor remained difficult. Heavy cargo demanded lifting. Storms sometimes appeared suddenly. Long journeys separated workers from families for weeks at a time. Near midday, the full weight of Egyptian heat settled over the land once again. Workers narrowed their eyes against the glaring sunlight. Air shimmered above roads and rooftops. Even the birds became quieter during the hottest hours. In the harvest fields, labor slowed slightly. Workers rested beneath woven shade coverings stretched beside the crops. Bread and onions passed from hand to hand while water jars emptied steadily. One older farmer removed his sandals and flexed swollen feet carefully in the shade. Years of standing in fields had thickened the skin along his heels and toes until they resembled rough leather. He drank slowly from a clay cup and stared silently across the bright fields. The younger workers nearby still carried more energy. But even they moved carefully now beneath the crushing heat. In another village farther south, women gathered along shaded courtyards spinning flax fibers into thread using small wooden spindles. Their fingers moved continuously while children played nearby in the dust. The spinning work seemed gentle compared to quarry labor or farming. Yet it lasted hour after hour, day after day, month after month. Hands cramped, eyes strained, shoulders stiffened from repetitive movement. One woman paused briefly to stretch her aching fingers before returning to the thread twisting carefully between her hands. Ancient Egypt rested upon countless forms of repetitive labor that rarely appeared in grand carvings or temple walls. Invisible work filled the spaces between monuments and kings. Cooking, weaving, repairing sandals, cleaning fish, mending nets, grinding grain, fetching water. The ordinary routines of survival. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, a faint breeze returned from the Nile. Workers lifted tired faces toward the cooler air while shadows lengthened gradually across fields and roads. The harvest crews gathered their final grain bundles onto wooden sledges pulled slowly by oxen toward storage buildings. Dust rose gently behind them in the fading light. Children walked beside the animals carrying loose stalks gathered from the ground. The long day neared its end. In the cities, merchants covered goods for the night while potters stacked unsold vessels carefully beside workshop walls. Bakers swept ash from ovens. Scribes rolled completed documents into storage jars. The entire land seemed to exhale slowly as darkness approached. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared evening nets while sunset painted the Nile in soft orange and gold. Water birds crossed low above the glowing surface. Palm trees stood dark against the bright western sky. One fisherman sat quietly repairing torn netting beside his small boat. His fingers moved automatically through the worn fibers. He could hear distant laughter from a nearby village where workers gathered after labor beside cooking fires and shared beer. Simple moments. Brief moments. But important ones. Because life in ancient Egypt was difficult, and people held tightly to small comforts whenever they appeared. As night slowly returned across the river valley, lamps flickered inside mud-brick homes once more. Families gathered close together over evening meals of bread, lentils, fish, and onions. Outside, the stars emerged one by one above the ancient river. And the workers of Egypt, tired beyond words, slowly drifted toward sleep again beneath the warm desert night. The desert wind moved softly across the Nile during the final quiet hours before dawn. The river reflected pale starlight in slow trembling lines while reeds whispered gently along the dark banks. Ancient Egypt rested beneath the cool night sky, suspended for a little while between yesterday's labor and the work that waited with the coming sun. Inside the villages, most fires had burned low. The smell of ash lingered in narrow streets between mud brick homes. Clay jars rested beside doorways. Sandals lay abandoned near sleeping mats where exhausted workers barely moved through the night. In one small riverside house, a woman opened her eyes before anyone else in the family. For a moment she listened to the silence around her. Her husband slept nearby, one arm across his chest after a long day hauling grain sacks near the docks. Her youngest child murmured softly in sleep. Somewhere outside, a donkey shifted against its tether. The woman rose quietly. The floor felt cool beneath her feet as she crossed the room toward the grain basket near the wall. Soon she would begin grinding flour for bread before dawn arrived fully. This was how nearly every morning began for her, and had for many years. The labor of ordinary life often started in darkness. She stepped outside carrying a small oil lamp. The flame trembled gently in the moving air. Across the village, other tiny lights flickered awake one by one as more households slowly rose from sleep. Ancient Egypt woke gradually. A baker preparing ovens. A fisherman checking nets. A farmer feeding animals before sunrise. A servant carrying water through quiet streets. The woman knelt beside the heavy grinding stone in the courtyard and poured grain carefully across its surface. Then the familiar motion began again. Push. Pull. Crush. The sound was low and steady in the darkness. Grinding grain consumed countless hours throughout Egyptian life. The work slowly damaged wrists, shoulders, backs, and knees over time. Tiny particles of stone mixed into the flour during grinding, wearing down teeth year after year once the bread was eaten. Still, bread remained the center of survival. Without bread, workers weakened quickly beneath the harsh climate and endless labor. As the eastern horizon slowly brightened, the village around her stirred more fully awake. Smoke rose from cooking fires into the cool morning air. Men stepped outside carrying tools. Children rubbed sleep from tired eyes. The smell of baking bread slowly spread through the streets. Farther downriver, near a larger city crowded with workshops and storehouses, dock workers had already begun unloading cargo boats arriving before dawn. The riverbanks echoed softly with movement. Wood creaking. Ropes tightening. Footsteps on damp planks. Voices speaking quietly in the half-light. One boat carried clay jars filled with beer from a northern settlement. Another transported baskets of dried fish. Others brought papyrus bundles, linen cloth, vegetables, and grain. The dock workers moved carefully beneath heavy loads balanced across shoulders and backs. Their muscles ached constantly from lifting. Yet the river trade never truly stopped. The Nile connected Egypt like a living road flowing through the center of the land. Boats carried not only goods, but news, travelers, priests, officials, and skilled workers moving between distant places. Some laborers spent their entire lives beside the docks. One older dock worker now paused briefly beside stacked cargo jars while flexing sore fingers. Thick calluses covered his palms. His back bent slightly from years of carrying weight beneath the sun. He stared quietly across the water while dawn spread over the river. The sight never fully lost its beauty. Even tired workers noticed moments like these. Mist rising above the Nile. Birds crossing the pale sky. Palm leaves glowing gold beneath sunrise. Small peaceful things hidden inside difficult lives. Near the western cliffs beyond the river valley, quarry workers were already gathering tools for another long day. Their settlement stood dry and dusty beneath the fading stars. Rows of simple sleeping quarters lined narrow paths between storage buildings and work areas. The workers ate quickly before leaving. Bread. Beer. Perhaps dates or onions. Enough to begin the day. Then they walked together toward the quarry walls where stone waited beneath the growing light. The cliffs slowly changed color as sunrise touched them. Gray stone became gold and pale orange. Dust drifted gently through the still morning air. Soon the hammering began. Sharp sounds echoed across the quarry. Stone cutting required careful coordination. Workers carved channels into rock using copper chisels, pounding stones, wooden wedges, and endless repetition. Cracks had to be controlled precisely to prevent blocks from breaking incorrectly. The labor exhausted the entire body. Hands blistered. Arms trembled. Dust filled mouths and lungs. But skilled quarry workers developed deep understanding of stone through years of experience. They learned how rock sounded beneath the hammer. They watched for tiny fractures invisible to others. Knowledge passed slowly from older workers to younger apprentices standing nearby. At the same time, across green farmland near the Nile, farmers guided oxen through damp soil while preparing new planting rows. Wooden plows cut shallow lines through the earth. Birds followed closely behind, searching for insects exposed by the turning soil. The farmers moved slowly beside the animals. Sweat already darkened their linen clothing, though the morning remained cool. Agricultural life demanded patience above all else. Workers could not rush the river, the soil, or the growing seasons. Much of their existence depended upon waiting carefully while crops matured beneath the sun. Waiting for floods. Waiting for rain in distant lands feeding the Nile. Waiting for harvest. And while waiting, there was always work to do. Nearby, a young girl carried water jars between the fields and the village. The jars pressed heavily against her thin arms. She walked barefoot across dusty paths already warming beneath the morning light. Children in ancient Egypt often entered the world of labor very early. Not through cruelty alone, but necessity. Families depended on every capable pair of hands. Boys learned farming, fishing, or trades from fathers and older brothers. Girls learned household labor from mothers and grandmothers. Childhood blended slowly into adult responsibility without sharp separation. Still, children found moments for play whenever possible. Laughter appeared suddenly between chores. Games in the dust. Splashing beside canals. Chasing goats through village paths. Life carried both weariness and tenderness together. By mid-morning, the heat strengthened across the river valley. Sunlight reflected fiercely from whitewashed walls and pale stone surfaces. Workers wrapped cloth around heads and necks while searching instinctively for narrow strips of shade. In a weaving workshop near Memphis, rows of women sat beside looms inside a crowded room thick with warm air and floating fibers. Linen threads stretched tightly between wooden frames while hands moved in practiced rhythm. Pull. Cross. Tighten. Repeat. The sound filled the workshop softly like steady rainfall. One older weaver blinked tired eyes against drifting dust. Her fingers continued moving automatically across the loom even while her thoughts wandered elsewhere. Perhaps toward home. Toward children. Toward evening rest that still remained many hours away. The workshop smelled of flax fibers, warm wood, sweat, and lamp smoke trapped beneath the ceiling beams. Near the doorway, an apprentice sorted tangled thread into neat bundles while sunlight spilled across the floor in bright narrow strips. Outside, merchants crossed crowded streets carrying baskets of figs, onions, garlic, and fresh bread toward market stalls. Donkeys pressed through the crowds beneath sacks of grain. Dogs wandered hopefully between food sellers searching for scraps. The cities of ancient Egypt were alive with movement during daylight hours. Yet even there, ordinary workers remained mostly unnoticed. Servants carrying water. Sweepers clearing courtyards. Porters lifting cargo. Cooks tending fires behind wealthy homes. Invisible labor surrounded everything. Inside one large household belonging to a government official, servants moved quietly through shaded rooms preparing the midday meal. One servant girl crouched beside a stone basin washing vegetables while another swept dust from painted floors using bundled reeds. The house itself felt cooler than the streets outside. Tall walls blocked direct sunlight. Curtains stirred gently in faint air currents. Pools of water in shaded courtyards cooled the surrounding rooms slightly. For wealthy Egyptians, comfort depended entirely upon the labor of others. Yet even privileged homes were not completely peaceful. Servants hurried constantly. Meals required planning. Linen needed cleaning. Supplies required tracking and storage. The machinery of daily life never rested. Near noon, the heat became overwhelming once again. Farmers paused beneath palm trees beside irrigation channels. Quarry workers crowded into narrow strips of shadow cast by cliff walls. Boatmen covered their heads with cloth while drifting slowly along the river current. Even animals moved more slowly now. Oxen stood quietly with lowered heads. Dogs searched for cool ground beneath walls. Birds disappeared into reeds and shade. One exhausted canal worker sat knee-deep beside moving water while washing mud from his arms. His skin burned from sunlight. Tiny insect bites covered his shoulders and neck. He closed his eyes briefly. The sound of flowing water soothed him. In ancient Egypt, moments of stillness carried great value because they were so rare. A cool breeze. Shade beside the Nile. Evening birdsong after labor. Workers learned to notice these small comforts deeply. As afternoon stretched onward, the brightness slowly softened again. Long shadows returned across fields and roads. Villages regained movement after the slow heavy hours of midday. Children carried bundles of reeds homeward. Women gathered water for evening meals. Fishermen repaired nets beside riverbanks glowing beneath late sunlight. Near a grain storage building, laborers formed long lines unloading sacks from transport carts before darkness arrived. Dust floated golden through the air around them. The work had to finish before night. One laborer stumbled briefly from exhaustion while carrying a heavy load. Another worker immediately stepped forward to help steady the sack before it fell. No words were needed. Many laborers understood one another through shared fatigue alone. As sunset approached, the entire Nile Valley changed color once more. Temple walls glowed orange. River water turned deep gold beneath the sinking sun. Palm trees stretched long shadows across the cooling earth. Cooking fires returned to life across Egypt. The smell of bread and lentils drifted through villages. Families gathered slowly inside homes while oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls. Outside, the river continued moving quietly through the evening light, just as it had for thousands of years, carrying the tired workers of ancient Egypt gently toward another night of rest. The evening breeze drifting from the Nile carried a faint coolness through the narrow streets of the village. After the crushing heat of the day, the air finally felt gentle again. Dust settled slowly onto quiet roads while cooking fires glowed warmly behind open doorways. Across ancient Egypt, workers returned home with tired bodies and slow footsteps. Some carried tools across their shoulders. Others balanced baskets of vegetables or bundles of reeds. Children walked sleepily beside parents after long days spent helping in fields, workshops, or along the riverbanks. The sky above the Nile deepened into soft shades of purple and dark blue as the last sunlight disappeared beyond the western desert cliffs. Inside one small farming home, a family gathered around a low clay table while oil lamp light flickered softly across the walls. The father sat carefully, lowering himself with the stiffness of a man whose knees had spent years bending in fields beneath the sun. His wife placed fresh bread beside a bowl of lentils cooked slowly with onions. Steam rose gently into the warm room. The youngest child leaned against her mother's side, already drifting toward sleep before the meal had fully begun. Meals in ordinary Egyptian homes were often quiet at the end of the day. Exhaustion softened conversation. Workers ate slowly, conserving energy even in small movements. But there was comfort in the routine. Bread passed from hand to hand. Clay cups filled with beer. The familiar smell of baked grain and smoke. Outside, insects hummed softly in the darkness. The family's home, like many others, had walls made from sun-dried mud brick mixed with straw. During the day, the thick walls trapped heat. But at night they slowly released warmth back into the cool air. The roof above was flat and simple. During the hottest seasons, family members sometimes slept there beneath the open sky, wrapped lightly in linen while listening to the sounds of the river and distant night birds. Across the village, another household remained awake longer than most. A weaver sat beside a small oil lamp repairing torn linen after finishing her regular work earlier in the day. Her fingers moved carefully through the cloth while shadows trembled against the walls around her. Evening often brought extra labor. Sandals needed mending. Fishing nets required repair. Tools had to be cleaned for morning use. Nothing could be wasted easily. Linen cloth especially held great value because creating it demanded so much time and effort. Workers treated fabric carefully, patching worn garments again and again before replacing them. The weaver rubbed tired eyes and continued stitching. Outside her doorway, the village had grown quieter now. Only soft voices drifted occasionally through the darkness. Farther along the Nile, fishermen moved silently across black water beneath the stars. Their boats glided between reeds while nets rested coiled beside their feet. Night fishing brought relief from the daytime heat. Moonlight shimmered softly across the river surface. The fishermen listened carefully to the sounds around them. Water against wood. Insects near the reeds. Birds shifting in darkness. One older fisherman stood near the edge of his boat and cast a circular net into the river with practiced grace. The weighted edges spread wide before sinking quietly beneath the surface. Then came waiting. So much of ancient labor involved waiting. Waiting for fish. Waiting for crops. Waiting for bread to bake. Waiting for floods to rise and fall. Life moved slowly beside the Nile. Back in the cities, some workshops still glowed with late-night activity. Bakers prepared dough before dawn. Potters checked kiln temperatures beneath the stars. Metal workers allowed furnaces to cool gradually while sparks drifted into the night air. One baker sat alone beside a warm oven shaping dough into flat loaves. His hands worked automatically after many years. Press. Turn. Shape. Place aside. Again. The smell of yeast and smoke filled the bakery. Outside, the city streets rested mostly empty beneath moonlight. Tall storage buildings and temple walls cast long shadows across the packed earth roads. Ancient cities became strangely peaceful at night. Without constant movement and market noise, even crowded places softened into stillness. Near one temple complex, guards walked slowly along outer walls carrying lamps and wooden staffs. Their footsteps echoed faintly against stone corridors cooled by darkness. Temples themselves required endless maintenance. During daylight hours, servants swept floors, trimmed lamps, cleaned sacred vessels, prepared offerings, and carried water through shaded halls. Even after sunset, the work never fully ended. Inside the temple storage rooms, jars of grain and oil rested carefully stacked beside linen bundles and carved wooden furniture used for rituals and ceremonies. Scribes tracked these supplies with careful attention because temples controlled large amounts of wealth and resources. Yet behind the organized records and polished stone stood countless ordinary laborers whose work sustained everything. Servants. Cleaners. Porters. Gardeners. Water carriers. Invisible hands supporting visible greatness. As midnight slowly approached, cooler air spread more deeply across the Nile Valley. Palm trees rustled gently beside dark canals. Dogs wandered through sleeping villages searching for scraps left from evening meals. Inside one humble riverside home, a canal worker woke suddenly from sleep with sharp pain in his shoulder. He sat up slowly in the darkness. Years of digging and hauling wet mud had damaged the joints in his body. Some mornings he could barely lift tools without pain. But he still returned to work every dawn because his family depended on it. He drank carefully from a clay water jar near the wall before lying back down beside his sleeping children. The room smelled faintly of river mud, dust, and smoke. Outside, the Nile continued flowing quietly under the stars. Pain was common among Egyptian workers. A sore back became ordinary. Cracked hands became ordinary. Swollen feet became ordinary. People carried discomfort through life with quiet endurance because there were few alternatives. Still, moments of care existed everywhere. One worker sharing water. A wife rubbing oil into tired shoulders. Children helping elderly parents walk home after labor. These small kindnesses softened difficult lives. Eventually the darkest hour before dawn returned once again. The night air felt cold enough now that some sleepers pulled linen cloths more tightly around themselves. Oil lamps had burned low inside most homes. Silence settled heavily across the villages. Then, slowly, the cycle began again. A rooster called somewhere near the river. A fisherman rose from sleep. Smoke drifted upward from the first cooking fires. Ancient Egypt awakened once more. Near the edge of a farming settlement, two brothers prepared oxen for another day of plowing. The animals snorted softly in the cool dawn while leather harnesses creaked in the darkness. The younger brother yawned heavily while rubbing sleep from his face. Neither spoke much. Words felt unnecessary this early. They guided the oxen toward damp fields where rich black soil waited beneath the fading stars. Irrigation channels glimmered faintly nearby. Soon the first pale sunlight touched the horizon. Birds began crossing the sky above the river. Mist lifted slowly from the water. The beauty of dawn often arrived quietly in Egypt before the suffering of heat and labor returned with the sun. Farmers noticed this beauty even while exhausted. So did fishermen. So did laborers walking toward quarry sites or crowded workshops. A few peaceful moments existed each morning before the world became heavy again. In one village courtyard, women gathered around grinding stones while children carried baskets of grain from storage jars. The scraping sound of stone against grain slowly filled the cool air. The women worked steadily while speaking softly together. Their conversations moved through ordinary concerns. Water levels. Family sickness. Harvest hopes. Repairs needed before flood season. The routines of daily survival. Nearby, a little girl tried to imitate the grinding motion using a smaller stone. Her mother smiled faintly while correcting the child's hands gently. Skills passed quietly from one generation to the next. Not through formal lessons, but through observation, repetition, and shared labor. As sunrise spread fully across the Nile Valley, fields turned gold beneath the growing light. Farmers entered rows of crops carrying baskets and tools. Fishermen returned with morning catches glistening inside woven nets. At the riverside docks, cargo workers prepared for another day unloading boats already arriving from distant settlements. One transport vessel carried large jars of oil secured carefully beneath linen coverings. Another brought timber floated downriver from foreign lands beyond Egypt's borders. Wood remained precious in Egypt because large forests were rare along the Nile. Shipbuilders, carpenters, and furniture makers valued every usable piece. Near the docks, carpenters were already at work shaping wooden beams with copper tools while wood shavings curled softly onto the ground. The smell of fresh-cut timber mixed with river air and damp rope. A young apprentice carried tools between older craftsmen while watching their movements closely. His hands already showed small cuts and hardened skin despite his age. Work began early in life, and often continued until the body could no longer endure it. By mid-morning, sunlight once again brightened harshly across rooftops and open water. Workers wiped sweat from faces and adjusted linen head coverings. Another long day stretched ahead. Another day of lifting, digging, grinding, rowing, weaving. baking, building. The great river flowed onward beside them all, calm and eternal, while ordinary workers moved through their endless routines beneath the warm Egyptian sun. Morning sunlight spread slowly across the Nile Valley, touching the tops of palm trees first before sliding down over mud brick homes, quiet canals, and narrow dusty roads. The coolness of dawn was already fading. Soon the familiar weight of heat would settle across the land once again. Workers moved steadily through the early light. Farmers crossed fields carrying wooden tools across their shoulders. Women walked carefully with water jars balanced against their hips. Children hurried beside older relatives with baskets, bundles of reeds, or small clay containers for grain. The sounds of waking Egypt blended softly together. Grinding stones scraping. Oxen breathing heavily. Birds calling near the river. Sandals brushing through dust. Near a village south of Abydos, a family worked together harvesting onions from dark fertile soil beside an irrigation channel. The father loosened the earth carefully with a hoe while his sons gathered onions into woven baskets. Their hands smelled strongly of soil and crushed plants. Nearby, the mother sat beneath a simple shade covering trimming roots and damaged leaves before the vegetables were carried to storage jars inside the home. Food preparation began long before cooking itself. Nearly every meal required hours of unseen labor. Cleaning, sorting, drying, grinding, preserving. Workers spent much of life preparing for future hunger while surviving present exhaustion. The irrigation channel beside the field moved gently in the morning light. Tiny insects hovered above the water surface while reeds swayed softly at the edges. The father paused briefly and splashed cool water across his face. Already sweat gathered along his neck. The Egyptian climate shaped every hour of labor. Workers learned to rise early because the midday sun became dangerous, especially during harvests or heavy construction work. Shade was precious. Water was precious. Even small breezes drifting from the Nile brought relief. Farther north, along a crowded river dock near Memphis, transport laborers unloaded sacks of barley from a large cargo vessel that had arrived during the night. The men formed a long line between the boat and nearby storage buildings. Lift. Carry. Lower. Turn back. Again. The repetitive movement never fully stopped. Dust from the grain floated through the warm air and settled across sweaty skin and linen clothing. Some workers wrapped cloth across their mouths to avoid breathing too much of it. One laborer stumbled slightly beneath the weight of a heavy sack. Another reached out immediately to steady him before the grain spilled. Then the line continued moving. Nearby, scribes sat beneath shaded awnings recording the deliveries onto papyrus scrolls. Their brushes moved carefully while flies drifted lazily through the heat around them. Numbers mattered deeply in Egypt. Grain measurements. Labor counts. Tax records. Supply inventories. Behind the grand temples and monuments stood an enormous system of organization supported by thousands of careful records. One young scribe dipped his brush into ink and paused briefly to stretch cramped fingers. Though protected from the hardest physical labor, he still worked long hours seated in uncomfortable positions beneath warm air and dim light. His back already ached. Outside, dock workers continued hauling grain beneath the growing sun. Along another stretch of the Nile, fishermen pulled morning catches from woven traps set overnight among thick reeds near the riverbank. Silver fish flashed briefly in the sunlight before disappearing into clay baskets. One fisherman smiled quietly at the size of the catch. A good morning meant fuller meals later. The fishermen worked silently for a while, listening only to birds moving through the reeds and water dripping from the nets. Their boats rocked gently beside the muddy bank. Fishing life carried its own quiet loneliness. Hours spent waiting, watching the water drifting slowly beneath the sky. Yet many fishermen preferred the river to crowded cities or dusty fields. The Nile offered moments of peace that were difficult to find elsewhere. Nearby, a young boy learned to repair torn netting beneath the guidance of his grandfather. Thin fingers moved awkwardly through the fibers at first. The old fisherman corrected him patiently. Skills passed slowly through generations this way, one careful lesson at a time. In the cities, the morning markets were now fully alive. Merchants called softly to passing customers while arranging dates, garlic, dried fish, pottery, woven baskets, and linen cloth beneath shaded stalls. The market smelled of many things together: fresh bread, sweat, river mud, spices, animal dung, smoke from cooking fires. Goats wandered between crowded legs while children carried small purchases homeward through narrow streets lined with whitewashed walls. Near the edge of the market, a potter shaped wet clay beside a spinning wheel beneath a woven shade covering. His hands moved with calm confidence developed over decades. The clay rose slowly between his fingers. Smooth, round, balanced. Beside him stood rows of finished jars drying in the sunlight. Pottery surrounded nearly every part of Egyptian life. Water jars, beer vessels, grain containers, cooking bowls, oil lamps all depended on skilled hands shaping river clay into useful forms. The potter's apprentice carried fresh clay from a nearby pile while trying carefully not to damage the drying vessels around him. One broken jar meant lost labor. And labor always mattered. Beyond the market streets, deeper inside the city, servants moved quietly through the homes of wealthy officials and priests. Some swept floors. Others prepared meals, washed linen, or carried cool water into shaded rooms. One young servant girl walked carefully through a courtyard carrying a heavy clay jar balanced against her shoulder. The house around her felt cool compared to the blazing streets outside. Tall walls blocked direct sunlight. Pools of water reflected gentle light beneath palm trees planted for shade. The wealthy lived differently from ordinary laborers. But their comfort depended entirely upon the endless movement of servants around them. In the kitchen area of the household, cooks prepared bread and roasted duck for the midday meal while smoke drifted upward through ceiling openings. The smell of herbs and cooking meat filled the air. Outside the kitchen doorway, another servant crouched beside a basin scrubbing linen garments in cool water scented faintly with oils. Her wrists hurt from twisting wet fabric. Still she continued. Labor filled every corner of Egyptian society, from the poorest farming villages to the grandest homes beside the Nile. By late morning, the sunlight sharpened across the land. Heat reflected fiercely from stone buildings and packed earth roads. Workers narrowed their eyes against the brightness. In the farming fields, harvest labor continued steadily despite exhaustion. One older woman gathered fallen stalks of barley left behind after cutting. She moved slowly now because age had stiffened her knees and hips. Yet she still worked because every stalk mattered for food storage later. Nothing useful could be wasted easily. Nearby, younger workers loaded bundled grain onto wooden sledges pulled by oxen toward village granaries. Dust rose softly behind the animals as they moved. The granaries themselves stood thick-walled and carefully protected from moisture and pests. Entire communities depended upon successful grain storage. A poor harvest season could bring hunger quickly. Egyptian workers understood this deeply. They respected grain almost as something sacred because survival rested upon it so completely. Near midday, the heat became nearly unbearable in open areas. Workers paused whenever possible beneath palm trees, linen coverings, or mud brick walls, casting narrow shadows across the ground. One canal worker sat beside flowing water eating bread and onions while insects drifted lazily through the reeds nearby. Mud still covered his legs from the morning labor. He stared silently across the fields. The sound of moving water soothed him. So did the breeze. Small comforts mattered greatly during difficult lives. Farther south, quarry workers crowded into shaded cliff edges while drinking from shared water jars during a brief midday rest. Their skin glistened with sweat and pale stone dust. The quarry echoed less loudly now. Most hammering had stopped temporarily until the worst heat began to fade. One younger worker leaned back against the stone wall and closed his eyes briefly from exhaustion. His chest rose and fell heavily while dust settled across his hair and shoulders. Nearby, older laborers spoke quietly about flood season predictions and grain prices in distant towns. Even during rest, thoughts remained tied to work and survival. As afternoon slowly stretched onward, a warm wind moved across the Nile Valley carrying the smell of river water and dry earth together. Palm leaves rattled softly overhead. Children in the villages fetched water for evening cooking while women prepared lentils, vegetables, and bread dough before sunset. One grandmother sat in the doorway of her home weaving a small basket from river reeds while watching younger children play nearby in the dust. The weaving motion looked calm and gentle. Yet her fingers were swollen from decades of labor. Still they moved skillfully through the reeds. Twist. Fold. Pull tight. Again. The children laughed while chasing one another between the houses. Their feet kicked small clouds of dust into the warm evening air. Even in difficult times, childhood still carried moments of joy. As the sun lowered toward the western horizon, workers across Egypt slowly turned toward home. Boats drifted back toward the docks. Farmers gathered tools from the fields. Merchants covered goods for the night. The light softened into deep gold across the river. Temple walls glowed warmly. Canals reflected the evening sky. Smoke rose upward from cooking fires beginning to fill the villages with familiar comforting smells. Bread baking. Fish roasting. Onions cooking slowly over open flames. One exhausted farmer walked home beside his sons carrying sickles and empty grain baskets. Dust coated their legs completely. But the cooler air brought relief at last. They could already hear voices from the village ahead. Already smell the evening meal. Already feel the slow quiet peace that arrived after labor ended and darkness began settling once more beside the ancient Nile River. The night settled softly over ancient Egypt. Along the banks of the Nile, the final cooking fires faded into glowing embers while warm darkness spread across the villages and fields. The long day of labor had finally come to rest. Farmers slept beside mud brick walls still holding traces of the sun's warmth. Fishermen tied their boats quietly along the riverbank before lying down beneath the stars. Bakers rested tired hands that had shaped bread before dawn. Weavers closed weary eyes after endless hours beside the loom. Across the land, the sounds of work slowly disappeared. No more hammering from the quarry walls. No more grinding stones turning grain into flour. No more carts creaking through dusty roads beneath the heat. Only the soft sounds of night remained. Water moving gently through canals. Palm leaves shifting in the breeze. Insects humming quietly beside the reeds. The Nile flowed onward through the darkness exactly as it had for thousands of years, calm and steady beneath the moonlight. Inside small homes, families slept close together on woven mats while oil lamps flickered low beside clay walls. The smell of baked bread, smoke, river water, and warm earth lingered softly in the still air. Children dreamed peacefully after long days beneath the sun. Old workers rested aching backs and tired hands. Somewhere in the distance, a reed flute played a slow quiet melody before fading into silence. The stars above ancient Egypt shone brightly over temples, fields, workshops, and sleeping boats drifting gently beside the shore. The great monuments stood quietly in the darkness, but beneath them all rested the ordinary workers whose lives filled the ancient world with movement, effort, and quiet endurance. And now, at last, they slept. The desert wind moved softly across the river valley. The water carried moonlight southward through the reeds. The villages grew still. And beside the endless Nile, ancient Egypt drifted gently into silence beneath the peaceful night sky.